Check, check. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Atlanta Council. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm the director of the Brent Scowcroft Center here on International Security and Atlanta Council Vice President. I'm really glad to welcome you all here today for what will surely be a very interesting and forward-looking conversation on Iran's current and projected conventional missile capabilities. This is a very important topic. I have some extensive personal experience having overseen the Obama administration's missile defense review that largely focused on Europe, interestingly enough, but that was really quite focused on Iran's current and projected capabilities at that time. So I almost see this as a much needed sort of comprehensive assessment of, was that direction still a useful one? If not, should we be thinking about making recommendations for the next administration, which will start in a few months here, to take a different approach with an updated assessment of the actual facts and trends on the ground. So it's a great time and a very important topic. The paper you see here, authored by Bilal Saab, who's the director of the Scowcroft Center's Middle East Peace and Security Initiative, and also by Michael Elliman, who's a consulting senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I won't preempt the discussion, but what Bilal and Mike analyze here might be a shift in Iranian missile policy, a shift from a focus on developing longer-range capabilities, which was the focus of the Bush administration at the time, to developing greater accuracy, which of course can complicate U.S. policy, as Iran could then project these capabilities to Gulf cities and to high-value assets. This capability set then raises several questions. How can the United States best work with the Arab Gulf countries on dealing with these challenges? In particular, furthering Arab Gulf missile defense integration, which has been quite elusive up to this point, and that's one of the reasons we're thrilled to have retired Admiral Fawzi Miller here, who was the commander of the U.S. Naval Forces in Central Command, and he concurrently served at that time as commander of the Combined Maritime Forces and commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. So Bilal and Mike, in addition to being moderated, if that's possible, by Ambassador Miller, we'll also be joined on the panel by Atlanta Council Board Director and Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad. He was former U.S. representative to the UN and ambassador to Iraq and Afghanistan, has a fantastic book out, which I commend to all of you, called The Envoy, as well as a very invaluable and active Atlanta Council board member here, and also Kelsey Davenport, who is a frequent contributor here. We have her on stage as much as we can. She's the Director for Non-Proliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association. We like to try to take the strategic view on issues that affect regional security. And so this is part of a long body of work. Most of you are probably aware of the Hariri Center's really interesting effort to develop a Middle East strategy under Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and former National Security Advisor Steve Hadley. That's coming soon, later this fall. That's one of those issues, and we are working with them, including the task force that traveled to six capitals in the region, including Riyadh, where we met with King Salman and met with other heads of state. And so watch that space. And then, of course, the Scowcroft Center has spearheaded a lot of projects on Gulf security and U.S. strategy in the region after the Iran deal. Bilal has routinely addressed these and other pressing Gulf security issues in his Gulf Policy Working Group. And we've also highlighted a lot of the issues and progress made since the U.S. GCC summits, with a whole sort of post-Riyadh campaign that covered a lot of different issues that were addressed at both of the recent summits. So I think with that, I want to get to the good stuff. I'd also like to remind you that please follow along and AC Scowcroft, and the hashtag is AC Mideast. Thanks very much, and I welcome the panel now on stage.
Everyone, and thanks to Barry for the introduction. Thanks to the Atlanta Council and the Brent Scowcroft Center for putting together this panel. Welcome to all of you, and welcome to those of you that are following on the web. A little bit about the flight plan for today. I will briefly introduce our our panel members, and then invite them to make some remarks about the paper and about Iran's missile program in general. Excuse me, and then we'll open it up to some questions and answers. So I'll begin by introducing Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad. He is currently the president of Gryphon Partners. He's also served as the permanent representative for the United States to the United Nations. Prior to that, he served as our ambassador to Iraq and to Afghanistan. He was also the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy to Afghanistan. He sits on a number of boards, including the Atlantic Council here, the National Endowment for Democracy, the RAND Corporation, and American University of Iraq and American University of Afghanistan. He travels extensively throughout the region and is often called upon by regional leaders for advice. He has his bachelor's degree and master's degree from American University in Beirut, as well as a PhD from the University of Chicago. One of the co-authors of the paper is Mr. Michael Ellman. He's a consultant and senior fellow for missile defense at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He's the principal author for ISS Strategic Dossier on Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, a net assessment. He is also responsible for continuing research on the missile and space programs of North Korea and Iran. Before joining IISS, Mike spent 5 years at Booz Allen Hamilton, where he supported the implementation of the cooperative threat reduction programs and sponsored by the U.S. DoD and Department of Energy. Prior to that, he spent 18 months at the United Nations Monitoring, Verification, and Inspection Commission as a missile expert for weapons inspection missions in Iraq. Before joining the UN, Mike spent 2 decades as a scientist at Lockheed Martin's Research and Development Laboratory. From 1995 to 2001, he led a cooperative threat reduction program in Russia aimed at dismantling obsolete long-range missiles, and Mike's a graduate of physics from the University of California at Berkeley. Ms. Kelsey Davenport is the Director for Non-proliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association, where she provides research and analysis on nuclear and missile programs in Iran, North Korea, India, and Pakistan, and on nuclear security issues. Kelsey joined the Arms Control Association in 2011 as the Herbert Scoville Jr. Peace Fellow. Prior to coming to the Arms Control Association, Kelsey worked for a think tank in Jerusalem, researching regional security issues and Track 2 diplomatic negotiations. She has a master's degree in peace studies from the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, and she graduated summa cum laude from Butler University with a BA in International Studies and Political Science. And then our final panelist, of course, is Bilal Saab. He traveled the least distance to be here because he is a senior fellow and director of the Middle East Peace and Security Initiative at the Brent Scowcroft Center here at the Atlantic Council. And he also chairs the Gulf Working Policy Group and Middle East Crisis Simulation Series. Bilal is also a monthly columnist with The National, and he has more than 14 years experience working as a political analyst and advisor. He's had positions in a number of think tanks, including Brookings, the Center for Non-proliferation Studies, CSIS, and the Middle East Institute. He has master's degrees from the University of Maryland, College Park, and also from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and a bachelor's degree from American University in Beirut. So once again, thanks to the Atlantic Council for putting together a truly excellent panel. Ambassador, we'll start with you, and I'm wondering if in your remarks you can address a couple of questions. The first of which is really, what risks do the enhanced Iranian missile capabilities pose to the United States and pose to the partners? And then given the maturity of the Iranian ballistic missile program, what should the partners be doing, and given the progress or lack of progress that they've made thus far, what expectation do you have that they'll do the sort of things that they should be doing?
Well, thank you very much, Admiral. It's a pleasure to be here. The credit goes to Mike and Bilal. My role with regard to their paper was to write a very short preface, and I'm delighted that they asked me to do that. With regard to the issue and the questions that you've asked, Admiral, I'd like to use the 10 minutes that we're assigned to make 4 points. Point one is that the Iranian missile program is part of a larger set of concern that we have globally about proliferation. And in this new era, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and missiles really rank among the highest priorities of U.S. national security concerns. And although we have reached an agreement with Iran, have implemented for the duration that is envisaged, there is some constraint on the nuclear program of Iran, which was of great concern and remains of concern, but in a different way. But the missile program was not directly affected by that agreement. And although the paper does argue that there is a shift in terms of Iranian emphasis on having more capable, in terms of accuracy, in terms of payload, in terms of control, to be more lethal, in a regional sort of context, medium-range missiles. But I don't think one can count that the emphasis could not change again. And therefore, it's not out of the question that over time, the Iranian missile program could pose a threat to the homeland, to the United States itself, and to its allies in Europe and elsewhere. Iran has launched several satellites, and the knowledge and experience and gained from the launch of those missiles have direct applicability to the development of ICBMs. So, and I think a paper does mention that our intelligence community's assessment appears to be that if they decide to do so, develop an ICBM, we're talking about maybe within a decade. And that's not a very long time in terms of military planning when you think about the future of the world. So that is one, that there is a global dimension to this program. And the homeland security issue ultimately cannot be kind of put aside completely, although the emphasis is on the region. Second point is that the missile program of Iran is part of a set of undesirable, I wanted to say deplorable, but then I remember that it was a set of developments in the region and that affects our interests, a region that poses some of the most urgent national security issues that the world faces. And that has to do with kind of regional wars in Iraq and Syria that has helped provide an environment in which terrorism, which is a global threat to all of us, has grown. And Iran has had a direct role in the instability and conflict that has taken place there, and the overall Iranian effort aimed at regional preeminence in that region, and also its use of proxies very effectively as another tool. Its use of cyber as yet another tool. It's, as we see every day, or recently in the Gulf, harassment of kind of some kind of guerrilla warfare sort of in the Gulf. And the missiles seem to be part of a program to be able to do asymmetric damage threats to its adversaries for purposes of deterrence, and perhaps in the future for conflicts, concluding conflicts on its terms. Now, point three is the more specific issue of the challenge narrowly of missiles. Now, Iran developed its missiles. We all remember, because I myself was in the Department of Defense when the Gulf War started. I'm talking about the Iraq-Iran war, and it was the Iraqis that attacked Iranian cities with missiles, and that encouraged Iran, as the papers argue, to develop its own, and they did. And once they had developed some rudimentary capability of their own, Saddam reconsidered attacking the cities, and there was periods of suspension of attacks, the war of cities. And over time, I believe that Iran came to a judgment that having nuclear weapons and missile programs that can deliver them extensively was important, a lesson they learned from the Gulf War. I remember that in the post-Gulf War, several countries did lessons learned. We did our own lessons learned. In fact, I headed our lessons learned when I was in the Pentagon. But a lot of countries did theirs, including Iran, India, and a few others. And surprisingly, one conclusion that many of them drew was, if you want to avoid a fate such as the one that Iraq suffered, you need to have nuclear weapons and missiles. But we know, I referred to the nuclear agreement earlier. The manifestation of an interest in the nuclear weapons was the activities that took place for many years. But the missile program has continued. At this point, as the paper ably demonstrates, these missiles are more, although they have grown in numbers significantly and in range, but they are largely valuable as weapons of terror, as deterrent weapons to go after big targets because they are inaccurate. And they're not that useful in a narrow counter military targets, small defended military targets. But that is beginning to change, and they're going for greater accuracy, greater lethality, greater range, up to about 2,000 kilometers. And this would give them more options compared to the capabilities that they have now, and thus complicate responses and put more demands on the defenders, which means that missile defense, which there is a lot of effort being made at the region level and by us in the region, but there has to be adaptation because there is sort of action-reaction that would have to, as the numbers increase, as accuracies increase, the level of effort required to defend oneself, to defend against those missiles, would have to also have to adapt. And, the last and fourth point that I want to make is that thinking about the future of the region, again, a broader point, and the Atlantic Council is, in order to stabilize this region, a number of things are needed, ending the civil wars, some balance of power among the major regional powers, so to preclude hegemony by a single power, and the U.S. as a balancer, the ultimate balancer, the evolution towards mutual acceptance of between sects and between the three powers, the main regional powers, Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Some kind of CSCE type arrangements ultimately is part of the vision that places like the Atlantic Council are working on for the next administration to consider. But I think the missile challenge and how this challenge will be dealt with, in part by defense, whether there are opportunities for some sort of agreements in the context of building confidence, and cooperative arrangements need to be also part of the agenda. Although the prospect, I have to say, having just come back from the region, for such an outcome of a cooperative arrangement is extremely limited at this point. That what you hear is that the region is moving towards, if anything, more polarization and perhaps even wider conflict. I believe that the paper that has been done by Bilal and Micah is an extremely positive, timely contribution to take a kind of measure of where we are with regard to the Iranian capabilities on the missile front and its immediate, by immediate I mean the next 5 to 10 year horizon of where it's heading and what challenges that it poses. I have to say that the missile defense part, I know that there are some holes in the defense that exist, although a lot of effort has been made, and integration is a problem. But I was also, to end on a positive note, impressed that the regional leaders recognize both of those, and that our people dealing with this, with the region, recognize it. Now, that's necessary but not sufficient. But I think the paper has made a very positive contribution. And thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel.
Ambassador, thanks very much for your remarks. You bring up a number of good points that I'm sure we're going to have an opportunity to explore further during the course of the panel. In particular, this Iranian strategy, mosaic strategy that the paper does address, and it's the use of proxies both on the land and at sea, but also in cyber, and then perhaps an opportunity to discuss, how do they blend that with their missile program, which is, it would be something very overt and obviously lots of fingerprints on them. And then, of course, an opportunity to talk integrated air and missile defense, which will be something perhaps Mike in particular will get into. Mike, as we move to you, one of the questions I posed to you is how far have they come in their precision capability? Have they advanced enough? Are they doing enough testing? We find great consternation every time they test a ballistic missile, and we'll have a chance to talk with Kelsey here in a little bit about whether or not their missile tests, in fact, violate sanctions. But if you can address how far they've come, are they doing enough testing, and then perhaps what can we do to slow them down?
Okay. Well, thank you to Admiral Miller and to the Atlantic Council and Bilal, whose idea it was to write this paper. This is a topic that I've been following Iran's missile program for quite some time. So I think the first point I want to make is I'm really glad that at least for the next decade or so, we're talking about conventionally armed missiles and not nuclear armed missiles. So I think that's the first and foremost point to make is ballistic missiles can be an effective tool of warfare if you can make them accurate enough, if you have a strategy for employing them and understanding their capabilities and limitations. But I don't think there's something that can turn the tide of war. So I just wanted to put that out there. And the exception would be if they're armed with nuclear weapons. As I said, I've been following Iran's program for years. And last year, I started a small project to look at how Iran's missile doctrine or strategies was beginning to evolve. As Ambassador Khalilzad correctly pointed out, in the past, these have been a tool of deterring or coercing their adversaries or rivals in the region by threatening to strike cities. This is a lesson that they drew from the Iran-Iraq War and also from the Operation Desert Storm, where Saddam was able to create great havoc by attacking Israel and the Gulf states with his missiles. So, I mean, this is an embedded idea. It's a lesson that they have not given up on or relinquished. They continue to boast about the capabilities of their missiles to deter, and they even say they're poor defense and deterrence. Although my understanding is the Farsi word is a bit ambiguous regarding their conception of deterrence, which we can talk about a little later. Iran was quickly able to create the capacity with the help of North Korean supply of missiles and engines to threaten targets as far away as about 2,000 kilometers. In other words, they could hit their rivals of greatest concern. The U.S. in the Gulf, Israel, Turkish air bases that might be used in an invasion of Iran. And so that really met their need for most of the last 3 decades. However, as they watched the military buildup before Desert Storm, as they watched the military buildup before Operation Iraqi Freedom, they saw that it took quite a bit of time and to assemble the forces, and that any invading army would not just instantly appear in their territory. So they began in the late 90s to look at ways that they might actually be able to conduct warfare with missiles. They started off with their short-range systems, taking long-range artillery rockets and converting them into missiles by adding a control and guidance component. This began 15 years ago or so, and they've been slowly developing that capacity for their short-range systems, that is 200 kilometers and less, using techniques that are similar to the way our ATACMS system, the Russian Tochka missile, it flies within the atmosphere. They're making good progress, but they still can't achieve what they want. Let me give a couple examples. For a missile carrying a 1-ton warhead, it has to land within about 50 meters of its intended target to destroy it, depending on the hardness of that target. It can be 70 meters for people. It could be as little as 20 meters for a hardened target. So that means the missile has to land pretty darn close to the target. The Scud missile lands within 1 kilometer of its intended target about half the time. So obviously you would have to fire a lot of Scud missiles at a target. With the Fatah 110, it has, increasingly reduced, decreasingly reduced, its missed distances. Right now, as it stands, it's probably on the order of what a Scud missile is. At least if you look at the test results or the military exercises that were conducted in 2012. I suspect that they've made some advances since then. For that particular system, the technology they're trying to master, I think they'll probably require at least another 5 years, probably more. But the more important issue is they'll have to test them. Scores of tests every year. And that's not the pace of testing that we see today. Now, last year, about this time, they also presented a new missile called the Imad, which I believe means pillar. It is basically a Shahab-3 Ghadr-type missile, flies 1,600 kilometers, but it looks like it has a maneuverable warhead for making corrections during its descent towards the target. This is a very different technology than the one they're developing for the Fatah 110. And it took the United States, for Pershing 2, I think 15 to 20 years to master the technology. China is still trying to master it with the DF-21. Of course, they're going after a harder target, a moving aircraft carrier. And so this is not something that's going to occur overnight. I would say at least a decade, unless they got extensive foreign assistance from Russia or China. But more importantly, I think, is they would have to conduct a couple tests a month. The current pace of testing of the nuclear-capable missiles, that is, those that travel 300 kilometers or more, is right around 4.5 to 5 per year. And this is what it has been in the last 12 months. This is what it's been almost every year since about 2000, with 2 exceptions where they did no testing. And the other limitation is how many of these Scud and Nodong or Shahab-type missiles do they have? in their stockpile? Are they able to produce them indigenously, fully, or do they still have to rely on engines from North Korea, which in turn were from Russia? You know, if they only have 100 of these Shahab 3s, they'd end up using all of them in the developmental testing. So this is a dilemma that they face, and I think it's going to slow the progress unless they develop new missile systems that they can test at a greater rate. So I think, you know, for me, probably the most important thing for us to do now is to keep a watchful eye and make sure the Russians and Chinese aren't helping them, and see if they can master the technology, but it's going to take quite a bit of time.
Where else might they go besides Russia or China to get assistance?
Well, they could, in principle, go to Pakistan, which has a number of systems that are actually Chinese, and learn from how those are structured. But to duplicate the technology would require them to do a lot of testing. That could shorten the time frame, and it's another area where I would be concerned about. But I want to mention also, in addition to the missiles themselves, there's an enabling set of technologies or capabilities they have to develop in parallel, and that is to acquire the target acquisition, bomb damage assessment, the communication systems that network the entire thing. I mean, this becomes an architecture, if you will. It's not just the missiles themselves. Now, Iran is producing a fair number of UAVs, which are capable of doing reconnaissance. Whether they can do it over hostile territory, you know, that's a question that remains unanswered. If I had to guess, I would say that would be difficult. But these are, in order to use them effectively, especially against mobilizing forces that are, you know, gathering on your borders, you need to have this reconnaissance capacity to develop your target list, transmit that information to the missile units, then fire to those positions, and then do a follow-up and assess the damage that you were able to do. So it's not a matter of just the missiles. This is a system of systems that they need to develop, and that, for me, is probably a longer pole in the tent, but given the ubiquity of UAVs these days, maybe they can overcome that through imports and developmental activities themselves.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Kelsey, as we turn to you, one of the criticisms sometimes levied is the fact that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action did not include missiles, and that's a subject for a different discussion. But it doesn't necessarily curtail, or it doesn't curtail the ballistic missile activity, but perhaps the UN can. So one of the questions I have for you is, do we expect that the Iranians are going to try to increase their ballistic missile activity, and then what can be done about it? In the UN, what can the U.S. do? And it's a similar question I ask of Mike, but I ask you to approach it from a non-proliferation viewpoint.
Sure. Well, first, thank you to the Atlantic Council for having me, and of course to Michael and Bilal for an excellent report. I think it will be a great contribution to both correcting misconceptions about Iran's missile program, of which there are many, and also giving some important insights into where their program is going. But first, to your question about, will we see an increase in Iran's testing and Iran's ballistic missile activity? And I think to understand that, it's important to look backwards and to look at how Iran has treated UN restrictions on its missile program over the past decade. It was in 2006 that the UN Security Council first put sanctions on Iran, preventing them from importing technologies that would be relevant to developing its ballistic missile program. And that was all part of this larger attempt to push Iran to the negotiating table over its nuclear program. And I disagree that, that all of those restrictions should have been included in this pressure, and bringing conventional weapons into the discussion on Iran's nuclear program has certainly created complications now. But unfortunately, that decision was already made, and there's not a lot, we can't undo it. So how do we think about it going forward? Now, as Michael, I think, pointed out, Iran has not viewed these restrictions placed on it first in 2006, and then the testing restrictions placed on Iran in UN Security Council Resolution 1929 in 2010 that prevented ballistic missile testing as impeding the development of its program. It's never recognized them as legitimate, and they've continued to test on average before these restrictions and after at about the same rate, I think with the exception of some of the periods when they were involved in negotiations on the deal itself. So I think that we'll certainly continue to see sort of that rate of testing because Iran has never regarded both the sanctions or the restrictions as legitimate. Now, under the new UN Security Council resolution, which was passed in January, the one that affirms the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was, of course, the nuclear deal reached in July of 2015, this resolution keeps the sanctions in place on Iran's ballistic missile program. It prevents Iran, again, from importing these sensitive technologies or exporting them. But it softens the language on testing, and it's created, I think, a gray space where the P5+1, the countries that negotiated with Iran, can say that Iran is not following this resolution, and Iran can say, well, they are still abiding by the spirit of the resolution. And that's because the wording has changed somewhat. In this new resolution, Iran is called upon not to undertake testing of ballistic missiles that are designed to be nuclear capable. And that is a less stringent formula than the Resolution 1929, under which Iran, it was mandated that Iran shall comply with a prohibition on nuclear capable ballistic missiles. So essentially, since the UN Security Council agreement came into effect, Iran has tested missiles that are capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. So they surpass that threshold that Michael mentioned of a 500 kilogram payload over 300 kilometers. But Iran argues that they're not designed to carry nuclear weapons, ergo they're not a violation. And you can see the ambiguity that creates reflected even more prominently in a report that the UN Secretary General issued in July when he was asked to assess the implementation of the resolution. And he ultimately concluded that Iran's testing is unhelpful, and it does not, it does nothing to sort of, it destabilizes the environment. It does nothing to help with the implementation of the deal, but he didn't ultimately rule that these tests were a violation. So I think with that ambiguity and Iran's past disregard for the ballistic missile sanctions, we'll continue to see Iran sort of testing, and we'll continue to see them try and circumvent these sanctions to import materials that they can use for their ballistic missiles. Because that's something that we've seen as well that, in my mind, is a fairly good indication that Iran does not have the domestic capacity necessary to produce everything it needs to for its ballistic missile program. We've certainly seen in 2006 steel plates destined for Iran that were interdicted, different types of fuels that could be used for solid rocket propellant interdicted in 2007 and 2010, certain types of pumps in 2014. So there is this continued record of circumventing sanctions. And I think that needs to lead us to have an honest question about how much sanctions have actually impacted Iran's ballistic missile development. Because I think that should guide how we go forward when we think about areas to limit. Now, one of the arguments that I frequently heard about Iran's ballistic missile development being impeded is that, well, we haven't seen an Iranian ICBM yet. I think that the United States has done its fair share of encouraging the idea that Iran is actually seeking an ICBM, when I don't see indication that they're looking at those types of extended ranges. In part, repeated U.S. intelligence assessments that have said, with sufficient foreign assistance, Iran could test an ICBM by 2015. That came and passed, and as to paraphrase from my former colleague and good friend Greg Thielman, any country could get an ICBM with sufficient foreign assistance in a very short time period. So I think that those assessments, plus prominent Republicans in particular who oppose the deal, talking about the threat posed by Iran's ICBMs, have created this perception that that's what Iran is pursuing. Because we haven't seen it yet, the sanctions are working. And given that Iran has continued testing, that they've developed and tested more accurate missiles, I think that sort of really asking whether or not these sanctions are doing anything is critical. Now also, it's important to consider that as you increase sanctions pressure, if a country or group wants to circumvent those sanctions, that drives the price up for the companies that might be willing to do business with them. So essentially, more groups may be willing to enter that marketplace because the payoff is greater. And there's a very interesting study done on this by North Korea that came out recently from MIT and Harvard that talks about these unintended consequences. So that's why when we talk about how to stem Iran's ballistic missiles going forward, we need to look at areas that can complement sanctions, particularly looking at export controls and looking at strengthening interdictions. There was a Bush administration era initiative known as the Proliferation Security Initiative that brought countries together to focus on expanding capacity for interdictions. It did not create a new international law. It worked off of existing law and national authorities and essentially helped create a network of information sharing and also helped countries develop and refine their authorities for actually interdicting cargo that they believed was essentially illicitly bound to help WMD programs. There's been a fall off in terms of exercises, support, and activities of PSI over the Obama administration. And if we look at how Iran is obtaining some of the materials for continuing its ballistic missile program, and we want to stem them, that looking at where to direct PSI efforts, I think, could be very interesting. The Missile Technology Control Regime, another example. This is a voluntary group of countries that sell dual-use technologies that can be used for ballistic missiles. Areas where we could strengthen the MTCR again to prevent the flow of materials into Iran that it relies on for its ballistic missile program. I think one way to target that is through the MTCR. There are critical countries like Brazil and India and China that remain outside of the MTCR. And there are areas with notifications. When a country rejects a license for a dual-use technology, how are those notifications shared? Can we be more effective in alerting others that there might be attempts to circumvent sanctions? So I think not just relying on sanctions alone, but looking at these areas where we can strengthen and support the sanctions movement could help sort of stem and regulate the flow of materials into Iran that it does rely on for its ballistic missiles. But I certainly agree with Mike in his assessment that the missiles themselves do pose far less of a risk when they're conventionally armed as opposed to armed with a nuclear warhead. So continuing to support the nuclear deal, I think, should be paramount in decreasing the risk posed by those missiles.
Well, thanks a lot. You give us a great deal to think about, not the least of which is the relationship between ICBM development and the space program. And I think we'll have a chance to talk about that during the discussion phase. Bilal, as you look at this, in terms of military contingencies, really kind of broadly, how should we be thinking about this? What should we be worried about and planning for? How does the Iranian missile program fit into their overall strategy? If you could address that in your discussion, I'd appreciate it. And then how do you expect the Gulf states to respond to increased precision? And talk to us a little bit about how they're really thinking about it, particularly in light of the JCPOA.
Thank you, Admiral. Ambassador, I didn't know you went to EV.
I did.
We have that thing in common, I guess. Okay, so as important as it is to try to analyze how the Iranians might use these more accurate missiles, I think it's also useful to at least try to understand why they might use them. I mean, I think intentions matter here. We can't just freak out about capabilities and not take a moment to look at the intentions themselves. I mean, there's a reason why we don't care if this were Sweden that had these capabilities. This is a different country and there's been a debate about whether this is a status quo power, whether this is a revisionist power. I really don't care about these labels because they could be something at some point and then change at another. I mean, you don't really stick labels to nation states and they stick forever. I think they're both at the end of the day. So they can have offensive intentions and defensive intentions as well, or it could be a mix of both. But what I do focus on is that I think we can agree on this, is that they do have an interest in elevating their status in the region. And if they can be lucky enough to replace the United States as the most dominant power in the region, then so be it. So the question becomes, how do you do that, basically? How do you become the regional hegemon without causing a clash with the United States from which you probably may not recover? Let's not forget that there's an enormous amount of firepower in the region that we have, that our allies have. The British are back to Bahrain. France is also augmenting its capabilities in the region, not to mention that the Gulf states themselves have their own capabilities. So yes, the Iranians are improving their capabilities, but boy, are they faced with a set of adversaries that are far more powerful. But if the Iranians play their cards smartly, with this new capability, should it really become something interesting in the next few years, they can, I think, achieve 3 goals. Once again, if they pursue a pragmatic approach, a gradual approach to them, and a smart one without causing escalation and an open conflict with the United States. I think they've always wanted to test the coherence of the Gulf Cooperation Council. I think they've also wanted to test the unity and the strength of the partnership between the United States and its regional partners. And then the last one, which we have in the paper, I think, that they also want to test the resolve and the threshold levels of Washington. So this is how I think about these more accurate missiles. If they can use those to test these 3 things, then they have caused greater concerns in Washington and also in Gulf capitals. It may well be, and I don't want to completely discount this possibility, it may well be that these increased missile capabilities would still be used for augmenting their own deterrent. So bottom line, they might even have to use them at all. This is just to send a message to their adversaries that, look, we now have much more accurate missiles, and if you do attack us in any way, shape, or form, we now have more increased capabilities. But if you're sitting in the Pentagon, and specifically you're a strategic planner, you can't just settle for this is just for deterrence. You really have to think of exactly what you asked me, Admiral, about contingencies. As remote as they are, as unlikely as they are, you have to think about them, you have to plan for them, and you have to strategize for them. So I came up with really 3 basic ones. It could be a whole range of contingencies that we have to think about, and I included them in the paper. So the first one I think is the least likely one, because it has the highest chance of escalation and causing a clash with the United States. Once again, something they do not want, and they're very clear about that, which is that they would use these missiles to fire at a US military asset, whatever it may be in the region. I think that would almost certainly, I don't want to say it's automatic, but it's almost certainly, it would cause the United States to strike back forcefully. So that contingency, as remote as it is, we still have to keep in mind. Another contingency would be that, all right, so if this is really escalatory, then what else can they use those missiles for? Let's say they hit a value target, Arab Gulf value target. So it's a city, it's a water desalination plant, it's an oil installation. That's something to think about. Now, does that still have a high degree of escalation also, and to which we would intervene? I think so too. But compared with the first one, I think it's a lower likelihood of us intervening for one simple reason. I know it's politically controversial to say that, but the reason being is that at the end of the day, if US direct interests are not harmed, then it's not as automatic for us to really intervene and enter into a conflict with a foreign nation on behalf of partners with whom, by the way, we do not have formal alliances and defense pacts. These are informal security commitments that we have to them. I'm not saying we would not respond at all, but I think we will pause a little bit and think harder about risk-reward calculations. If you're sitting in Abu Dhabi or Riyadh, you definitely don't want to hear that. But that's reality. That's how nation states operate. Your self-interest first. The third contingency, which compared with the first 2, has a lower level of escalation, which to me is more concerning, of course, is if they hit actually something that's not a value target, but an Arab Gulf military asset. Let's say it's a radar. Okay, it's a really important radar, but at the end of the day, it's still a radar. that they have as part of the structure of the missile defense, right? If they hit it with a precise missile and wait for us to see how we respond, I think the likelihood of us responding to that is even lower than the first two. We might still do it and intervene, but boy, would we think really hard about going in, because at the end of the day, our ultimate objective in that region is still regional stability. And if we think that going after the Iranians would cause escalation and it will cause a sustained conflict with a nation that's there geographically, and we're not there, and we're just about to wrap up our involvement in the region militarily, and we have basically made a statement to all of our adversaries and our partners that we're pretty much really fed up with the region, then the last thing you want to do is enter into a sustained open-ended conflict with the Iranians. Those are three classes of contingencies that I have in mind, but I'm sure there's a range of others that could be far more narrow and sophisticated. Okay, so how the Gulf states, how should they be thinking about this or planning for this? What are some of the responses? I see three classes, basically, of responses. You fight fire with fire, in the sense that they start developing their own offensive missile capabilities. That's easier said than done, because A, it's not easy to pursue that, for reasons that Kelsey just mentioned. I don't know where they would get them. The MTCR is a huge factor. We certainly wouldn't sell them those, because not only are we members of that, but also other arms control agreements that prevent us from doing that. But let's just assume we were not part of anything, okay? Even if we had the desire to sell those missiles, I think that it will cause more problems for us and them than actually them just focusing on defense. Because for a long time, the United States has had an interest in preventing an arms race in the Middle East, and specifically ballistic missile proliferation in the Middle East. And for us to switch on that, I think, will be a big mistake. For a long, long time, we have advised our partners in the Middle East not to go for offensive ballistic missile capabilities and focus much more on deterrence and on defense. Now, they could still go to the Chinese. If I'm not incorrect on this, Kelsey, they're not part of the MCCR, right? They might have applied for membership, but they might have had a suspect record in terms of export controls. So long story short, they're not a member of MTCR. They might be a source for such missiles, perhaps even the Pakistanis, right? But we will continue to advise our partners not to go through that route, because it could be escalatory, and it might not even actually augment their own deterrent capabilities, because the Iranians are so sensitive about missiles for the same reasons that the ambassador mentioned before, because of what happened in the War of the Cities in 1988, that they might have to actually go after those missiles in a preemptive fashion. The second option that they might use, if this one is too problematic and we ultimately end up convincing them not to go through that route, is to really get serious about missile defense integration, right? I'm not going to rehash the story of that, because, boy, have we talked about it for so long that it's so important. Oh, my God, it's the most important thing ever in the Gulf. But the long story short is that the ball is in their court. Now, they'll tell you that there's a lot that we should still be doing to help them out with that. But I think the bottom line is that there is so much more that they should be doing still that they haven't done to achieve higher levels of integration, including the shared early warning system, that they don't agree on that. They don't do enough CONOPS. They don't do enough training, joint training. They don't even have a uniform assessment, actually, of the Iranian threat. So until you really get serious about all those things, then you can start complaining about Washington not providing the necessary technology. That's option number 3. And finally, option number 2. Finally, option number 3, which is, why don't you double down if you're a Gulf state, and let's just be honest, we're really talking about those two countries that have more adversarial relations with Iran, which is Saudi Arabia and the UAE, right? And they happen to be the more militarily competent and powerful countries in that six-nation group. The third option being is that you double down on your qualitative edge, and the qualitative edge is in their Air Force. They already have extremely superior capabilities to the Iranians. What you might want to do and add to that is really further invest in your standoff munitions, meaning that you can fire a missile or a bomb from outside Iranian airspace, okay? Now, it would depend on the range of what you really have, but that could be a nice counter to missiles without having going through the first route, which is developing your own offensive ballistic missile capabilities. Now, is that costly? Yes, but I think it's less costly than the first one. And neither of these are, all of them, they're not mutually exclusive. You can work on all three at the same time. But I would focus, if I were sitting in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, I would focus much more on the third one because it is achievable. You still retain the image of being a defensive power, which will give you a lot of sympathy in the international community. And if you go through the first one, then you're in that zone of countries, that category of countries where, just like the Iranians, you're perceived with some suspicion of why are you really developing offensive missile capabilities. So I'll stop there. There's much more details of course, but I'll stop here.
Okay, no, thank you. I appreciate that. I want to drill down a little bit more on this integrated air and missile defense piece, both with Mike and with you, the ambassador. So, Mike, what I'd like to ask you about is sort of the technical end of it, about what it would take to build in the Gulf a truly integrated air and missile defense capability. And given the systems that the Kuwaitis, the Emiratis, the Saudis already have in place, given what we have in place, you know, kind of technically, how difficult would it be for us to do that? And then I'd like, Ambassador, if you would comment, having just come from the region and based on some of the comments you made, what would it take sort of diplomatically to get us all in sync in an integrated air missile defense system?
Want me to go first? Okay. Well, I'll just shamelessly plug something. The ISS actually has a report that will be issued next month on integrated air and missile defense in the Gulf. Professor Toby Dodge and I and a team of people have been holding workshops and stuff in the Gulf, trying to assess, you know, how likely is it. And it was really interesting, some of the things that we found over the course of about a year and a half of work. I think the first and foremost challenge is all the parties need to have agreement on what it is they expect missile defense to do. Right. You know, you ask many of the Gulf specialists or advisors, you know, what do you expect missile defense to do? And they'll say, to protect us. Okay, protect what? And how and what level of protection do you require? And when you start drilling down on some of these questions, you draw some blank faces. And I think that the first thing is there needs to be a strategic community in the Gulf that looks at things like deterrence and capability and, you know, what are you trying to achieve? I think first and foremost that's what needs to happen. And I think this is where the United States has been very helpful on this joint ballistic missile early warning system. They've been dragging our Gulf partners through a requirements process and things of that nature. It's very tedious, boring, and all that, but it's a necessary step to get to where you want to be. Technically, fortunately, the Gulf partners have bought U.S. equipment, and in principle, it's all interoperable. In practice, it's not quite that way. I think there's some technical challenges to actually integrating things like Patriot and THAAD. You know, we can do it on the test range, so we know it's doable. But I think there's going to need to be a large investment in this particular element, actually the technical integration, creating the infrastructure that can carry the information, and probably, you know, the next step is to get each of the partners in the Gulf to, I guess, concede some level of sovereignty over their own defense. Mm-hmm. And you're not subcontracting it out to someone, but you're enhancing your own capabilities by adding together. So I think this is more of a political and psychological issue that they will have to get over. Are we optimistic? I think there are some steps that will be made in the future. You know, small steps like having a joint GCC kind of warehouse of spares and you know, all the equipment that you need, you know, maintenance equipment that you need. Maintain that as a group. You purchase it as a group, and that way you can get, you know, quick delivery of spare parts and things of that nature. And then the next step is the shared early warning system. I think the use of sensors is a very, that look out, most of it away from their own states, but you can peer into territory. This is an issue we'll have to get over. I think the work on the shared early warning system has been very helpful in them understanding exactly what the limitations are and what the capabilities need to be. And then you move to deeper and deeper levels of integration where maybe in addition to sharing sensors, you start permitting what they call launch on remote or engage on remote, and that is, say Abu Dhabi has a THAAD system and there's one in Qatar. Would Qatar share the sensor information in a way that would allow the Emiratis to actually launch their interceptor before their own radar sees the threat? And this greatly expands your capability no matter how you assess effectiveness. So I think those are the challenges that we'll be facing in the future, but I think that up to maybe launch and engage on remote, I think those are doable over the next decade. Building a centralized hub that coordinates everything, I think that's probably a reach too far, at least in the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Well, there are three issues. One is the issue of trust among the GCC states. The other, to summarize what was said, the other, the issue of capability, human capability to assess, strategize vis-a-vis all of these various components of an effective regional defense system. And third, the political will. My sense is that there is unevenness, and based on this trip, or the focus of the trip was Saudi Arabia, that some progress can be made on some things that includes a broader set of GCC members. But some is unlikely to happen if it includes everyone in the foreseeable future. So the question is there an approach, and that the core group, I mean, this may be difficult also to speak about, where the capacity and the will is there, and the trust is there, where they can make more progress at a faster pace, or this comprehensiveness in terms of participation and agreement is going to be really a cause for delay and continuation of this gap. So I don't know. I didn't get a sense that wasn't the focus of the trip, to get into the nitty-gritty of this with the type of people we were talking about too. But I suspect there may be more of a potential for a more differentiated kind of approach for success in the shorter term than a region-wide comprehensive approach.
Okay, thank you. I want to touch briefly on the Iranian space program, because there was a part in the paper about no nation having a history of taking a space launch vehicle and turning it into an IBM. ICBM. Although we have turned ICBMs into, that's how we got our own space program.
It's gone the other way.
And then, Kelsey, you had mentioned that there's no evidence that they're trying necessarily to develop an ICBM. So really, I think this question would be best directed at Mike. Do we then have a sense that the Iranian space program is a genuine space program, that they're interested in space? Because I think many people have thought it's really been a cover for something else.
Well, the answer to that is a little bit like the answer to their civilian nuclear program.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, they have a history of pursuing a hedging strategy, to leave the options open to do what they need to do. But the technologies they're working with today, well, let me go back. The space program, yes, they have a genuine interest in the exploration of space. They see this as a kind of a symbol of their technical prowess, and you know, in some ways, North Korea also pursues certain things to project prowess and national pride and such, to be, you know, considered one of the foremost nations in the world. And if you look at the structure of the Iranian space program, it appears to be directed at space. I think recently, it may be a year and a half or so now, they moved portions of the space enterprise outside the military. Not all of it, but portions of it. They're still supplied with the basic, you know, the engines and the boosters from the military, because they're the ones that acquire this capability. In terms of actually being able to use the space program effectively to develop an ICBM, as long as they're launching with Scud type or no-dong type engines, any resultant ICBM would be very large. I mean, we're talking, you've probably seen the Unha launcher that the North Koreans use. It's static, you can't move it around, it's probably not even transportable. It takes weeks just to assemble the thing. It would take time to fuel it, and while Iran has great strategic depth, it would be difficult for them to deploy this effectively. My personal view is they will probably continue to pursue hedging strategy for an ICBM. As you know, I mean, they've got 10, 15 years to develop the capacity, because they're not going to have a nuclear weapon anytime soon. I think the only reason to have an ICBM would be if you had nuclear weapons. So these two things, you know, have to be tracked together to get a better feel for what they're going to do. Just the last note on why hasn't anyone converted a satellite launcher into a ballistic missile? And it really basically comes down to operational requirements. Missiles have to be ready to fire 24/7 under any weather conditions or other you know, external environmental constraints. Whereas a satellite launcher, you can just do it when you're ready. And this means the reliability and all sorts of other and testing requirements are very different for a satellite launcher. And they're typically not optimized for the military role. They use different types of engines, or you know, thrust profiles to get into the nerdy technical stuff. But so far, what Iran has done and what they're projected to use for their space launch, they are optimized to put a satellite into orbit. But they're going to learn a lot, and all of this is applicable to an ICBM program at some point. So I guess I've dodged your question in a sense, but what would worry me is if Iran's satellite launch program began using technologies that were more consistent with the way you would build an ICBM. I think some of the things you've seen in North Korea of recent, the Musadan, this large engine test they conducted earlier this week, those to me are the truly worrying developments. And these are the types of engines that you could make an ICBM that is maybe not road mobile, but it's road transportable, and it would be very hard to target. But again, it takes, you know, from first flight test to having a reliable system, that's a 3, 4, 5 year period if you know what you're doing and have experience. For someone like Iran, I think it would be probably more than 5 years for it to be reliable, but does it have to be reliable? That's only, you know, the leaders of Iran can tell you that.
Okay, thanks. And Kelsey, this is something I think your organization also studies, so if I can ask you to comment as well.
Well, I never argue with Mike on the technical points, and I always take his word for it. So I think I would certainly agree with a number of the points that he made, but to also look at it from a slightly different perspective. Given that Iran has not considered itself bound by testing prohibitions in the past or by sanctions on its ballistic missile program in terms of exports, if it wanted to pursue an ICBM, why not begin taking the steps to do that? It's already violating the resolutions. It's already showing little regard for the new UN resolution on testing. So why not take that forward as well? I mean, what would the response be? I mean, in my mind, beginning to take those steps is not going to garner much more of a response, because in the US, we already think they're doing it anyways. So that's one point. But the other, and I should have made this in my initial remarks, is that lifting the sanctions on Iran that would allow it to import technologies for its ballistic missile program, that is largely in Iran's hands right now. Those sanctions will time out in October of 2023, but they can be lifted much sooner if Iran takes certain steps to cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency regarding transparency about its nuclear program. If they get to a finding by the IAEA known as the broader conclusion that has to do with ensuring that the program is peaceful, that there's been no diversion of material, then those sanctions can be lifted sooner. And Iran is not, taking a lot of steps to move that process along. They could probably get there in as little as 3 years if they wanted to, but they're not hurrying that up. So if they really wanted to extend their ranges, if they wanted to put themselves in a position where they were working towards an ICBM, by the time the restrictions on their nuclear program came out, why not begin doing that now? So I said to me, it seems, that coupled with what officials in the Rouhani administration have said about looking at missiles with ranges below 2,000 kilometers, I think, to me, it just indicates that there is less of an interest at this time at going down that path.
But the key point, I assume, is at this point that if for the immediate future, the emphasis, the requirement that they have put perhaps on their planners is for the region, as part of their effort to be the preeminent, let's say, regional power. That doesn't preclude that at some point they could develop ambitions for developing an ICBM, and some of the things they are doing with regard to space, or even with regard to the improving their regional capabilities, can have relevance for developing the longer range capabilities. So what I suppose the difference is on emphasis, that one doesn't preclude over time to evolve into the other.
No, certainly. And I do think that that's why we shouldn't be complacent about Iran's activities. And we should look at some of these areas that might help support the sanctions that are in place now, and continue to act after the sanctions, so that if they do choose that path, there are still impediments in terms of getting the technology and material that would be helpful.
Sure.
I think it's important also to remember that the costs of building developing an ICBM are enormous. One only has to follow the debate in this country about the cost of the Air Force ICBM. They can't even settle on what it's going to cost right now. But certainly we're going to make something much more capable, and it'll be much more expensive to do than for Iran or for other countries. But I think it's important, is this something they're willing to invest in when they could probably reach or attain most of their strategic goals doing it regionally?
And when the sanctions on ballistic missiles come off, it could be around the time that that the arms embargo comes up. So where are they going to want to invest?
Exactly.
That, I think, is a very interesting question that I don't know the answer to.
Okay, I have one final question, and then we'll open it up to the group. We've talked about the battle of the cities a couple of times, and that being a driver in many cases for their ballistic missile development. One of the concerns I had when I was a Fifth Fleet commander was how the Iranian calculus would change if their missiles were just at a little bit better range and were a little bit more accurate. If they were accurate enough to hit the pier at Maina Salman or hit the headquarters and not worry about hitting the Shia neighborhoods that surrounded the base. So would they be more willing to fight the battle of the cities, understanding that the counter battle wouldn't be Iraqi Scuds, it would be GCC aircraft with precision weapons in all likelihood. if their missiles were just a little bit more accurate and had a little bit better range, and how would that look like? And I'll just throw that out to the group.
It's kind of like threading the needle, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you want to try to accomplish the objectives that I laid out before, but at the same time, prevent serious escalation and a clash with the United States. And it's really tricky to do the things that you just described, Admiral, without really causing us to intervene forcefully. It goes back to issues that have nothing to do with weapons, and the ambassador talked about, like resolve, political will, our own calculations of our own interests there, what really merits our intervention, what are the biggest stakes that we have there, what are the most important priorities. Those are things that have nothing to do with weapon systems, but it's a very tricky balance. And because there is an inherent risk of escalation, they have to think really, really hard about how to use those.
Admiral, the way I look at the increased accuracy and what it might do for Iran, I think one of the major changes would be their willingness to use them, as you said. It provides them with a lot greater operational flexibility, and that's of concern. And I think it's precisely that worries me the most. Is it opens up the window of possibilities for them as they become increasingly more capable and less the risk of collateral damage or striking the wrong target. That's not just the collateral, but the political and diplomatic damage it would do. So this is something they have to be that they're likely thinking about, and it's one of the drivers behind the search for greater accuracy. One thing we haven't talked about is Kuwait. Kuwait is much closer geographically to Iran and is susceptible to not only artillery rocket fire, but also these shorter range systems that are highly accurate. And I mean, I think the Kuwaitis have different strategic requirements for defending themselves than, say, the Saudi Arabia, or to reach Saudi territory from Iran, from a safe distance inland in Iran, you need something greater than 300 kilometers. You probably need to be in the 500-kilometer range of capability. So right now, Iran has a limited number of these systems. So just looking at this, I think we need to look more at the war-fighting capacity that they're trying to develop and how we're going to defend against that. It's basically an extension of area denial strategy, which they're practicing with their asymmetric capabilities.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm happy to open it up to questions now, please. If you wait for the mics to come around, and then when you get a mic, please identify yourself and what organization you're from. We'll start with Harlan, please.
I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council. Thanks very much. An observation and a couple of questions. It seems to me that any military wants to move from a science project to an effective weapons systems. And when you have a missile that has an accuracy of plus or minus Kuwait, certainly 50 meters is much more desirable. So I think this is inherent to militaries, irrespective of the strategy. It just makes more sense to make something more effective. Question for Zal and a question for you, John. Zal, Iran has many tempting targets potentially from Riyadh to Ankara to Tel Aviv. To what degree do you think Israel has entered into their thinking about their missile systems? And John, this is a little off the subject of missiles, but very important. Iranian gunboats have been harassing American ships for quite a while. I know you tried this, but what opportunity do you think exists for some kind of an incidents at sea agreement being reached to prevent these interactions? Because there's always the prospect of a Vincennes, and quite frankly, you must have done a tremendous job as Fifth Fleet Commander to discipline your skippers, because I know if I was in that position, I'd be awfully interested in pulling the trigger once and twice to just show them a lesson.
Well, on the Israel part, my suspicion is that this is very much part of their thinking, to deter an attack from Israel and to be able to respond and to do damage. And that's why I think also they're thinking a lot about survivability of their systems in terms of numbers, in terms of mobility, in terms of being underground, and when we think about GCC and us, maybe it's outside the box right now, but I don't rule out over a longer term period missile defense cooperation between not only us and the Gulf states, but Israel and the Gulf states. Because one of the things that I heard was that they don't see anymore Israel as a military threat. That in fact they see that on some major issues, it's a very identical threat perception. And so, but I think to go back to your question, I think that's, I suspect that's one of the main factors in the Iranian strategy and planning.
Thanks for the question. I think there's very little opportunity for any kind of an agreement with the Iranians. You know, we maintain a hotline, if you will, in the Fifth Fleet headquarters. At least they did, and I assume they still do. And we can't get the Iranians to use that. Right. And we always thought that would be useful as a way to defuse tensions should something happen at sea. There's a couple points though that are interesting. The kind of behavior that we've seen, which I used to describe it, and previous Fifth Fleet commanders did, as buffoonery, and we would quantify the the probability of buffoonery, the B sub B, but it's increased over the last year, but it's not enormously increased. It's just higher. One of the things that's always been difficult to do is to understand at what level that occurs. Is it on that particular patrol boat? Is it a district headquarters? Is it something higher? So if you look at the last several incidents over, there were 4 in a week. What was interesting about them is they occurred from the Strait of Hormuz to the Northern Arabian Gulf. Well, that cuts across all the IRGCN districts, which tells me that's a high level, and so those were very much done on purpose. They're intended to provoke, and they got, and that was a provocation that got all the way up to warning shots. And then what happened? There's only been one incident since then. So that tells us a lot about the Iranians. Now, what the Fifth Fleet is pretty good at doing is what you alluded to, is providing guidance to the commanders. There are procedures to go through. It's an understanding that this is not necessarily a hostile act, that this is a provocation. And so in order to keep it from escalating into something that no one will benefit from, a tactical action with strategic consequences, stick to the procedure. So I think we'll just continue to do that. Why the Iranians find this beneficial is a little bit mysterious, I think, to all of us. But I think we can all be very proud of the way that the sailors out on the deck plates have conducted themselves.
Admiral, may I add just a quick point to what the ambassador said? And it relates to your question. I think as far as Israel is concerned, and you can never rule out anything, of course, but I think that it's almost exclusively geared toward deterrence, the Iranian posture. And you can see that also with Hezbollah across the border. 2 reasons for that. I think there's a higher degree of appreciation by the Iranians of the relationship between the United States and Israel. They have more doubts about the relationship between the U.S. and the Gulf partners. But when it comes to Israel, they know that it's almost a red line. And 2, which brings up the second point, is that because of that, there's a lower level of Iranian adventurism when it comes to Israel. And they have also a healthy appreciation for the Israeli military capabilities, far more than the Gulf capabilities, even though those are quite considerable too. So for that, I think it still really is based on deterrence. I mean, who knows? I mean, 2006 happened, as you know, out of an accident and miscalculation. So that could easily also happen between these two. But they're far more on the defensive and the deterrence side with Israel than it is with the Gulf states.
Right.
Okay, the gentleman over here.
Samar Chatterjee, Safe Foundation. Interesting that this panel, there was no one who mentioned during the entire panel presentation Israel, but for the first question, and my question related to Israel, and I guess you mentioned that the Iranians no longer consider Israel to be the major threat. But I thought all of their development was to placate Israel. And Israel, if it finds a very favorable US president who would encourage them, like George Bush did, to do whatever you want, could find an excuse to attack a nuclear facility or some facility in Iran, and then a response would be required from the Iranians. So will this missile development or nuclear development, what implications would it have?
Well, you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. Respectfully, sir, I didn't say that they do not perceive Israel to be a threat. As a matter of fact, they're pretty high on that list of threats. But I did say that their posture is geared toward deterrence. History suggests the way they have armed Hezbollah, the way they have conducted themselves vis-a-vis Israel, is that they've always been on the defensive. Just to narrow down more in the question, what was precisely the question, if you don't mind?
If Israel were to start the offense on some excuse, will there be a response from Iran? And is all this development only meant for that? Because I don't think U.S. will. U.S. will be seen, if it attacks Iran, as a bully, in the world. In the international community, it will be viewed, and that may be the reason why, when they arrested those American seamen and so on, the U.S. did not react in a very adverse way, which U.S. can. The U.S. has the ability to, but the whole world would consider it to be a very bully action by the United States, and probably brings in Russia and China and all that into that.
Okay. So I'll just make a quick point. I'm sure the panelists also have other thoughts on this. Really depends on the lethality of the strike, but I would say that they wouldn't let something like this go without a response. And the preferred course of action has always been for them to work through proxies, and they happen to be quite lucky to have a pretty significant counterstrike in Hezbollah. This is not a non-state actor that really is insignificant or does not have considerable military capabilities. They do. So they will probably fight to the last Lebanese instead of really causing a direct clash between the two. That would be my assumption, but I could be wrong. They also have an interest in preventing escalation, because the Israelis, I would say, depending if this will be a sustained conflict, I think they have the advantage if we were not to intervene. But the Israelis, for the short term, maintain escalation dominance. So the Iranians have always been very sensitive to that.
Yeah, just one point, and it brings up something I neglected to actually bring up in the paper itself.
It's too late now, Mike.
Yeah, I know. It's that's the problem with deadlines. If you look at the history of Iran's program, they spent from about 1995 till 2010 trying to create the capacity to retaliate with missiles launched from their own territory that could reach Israel. It's a minimum of 1,000 kilometers, but if you want to, launch from areas that are more protected, it's 1,300 kilometers. That was the focus of their program from 2000 to 2007 or 8. So I think they definitely have in mind of some form of retaliation.
Yep.
The other form of retaliation is they have been supplying Hezbollah with, tens of thousands of missiles. Fatah 110 is one of them. And this is, one of the concerns is if they provide a highly accurate system to Hezbollah, then they might be able to conduct attacks that they otherwise could not without the fear of inadvertent escalation if they're attacking just airfields that are being used to attack southern Lebanon, for example. But Hezbollah will lack the targeting and all those capabilities, but they could harass air operations more effectively. So I think that's something we need to keep in mind and watch what Iran is exporting.
Sure.
Okay, gentleman in the yellow tie.
That's you, Tom.
So Tom Carrico, CSIS. I really want to commend you, Mike and Bilal, for this paper, which I think is important because, as you state right in the conclusion, it challenges the conventional wisdom that post-JCPOA Iranian missiles don't matter, right? This paper seems to say they do.
They might.
They might. There's a lot of mights here.
Right.
But given that, I was struck by the relative absence on the panel, maybe I missed it, of a call for, I would say, a concerted diplomatic effort to post-JCPOA roll back and put limits on Iranian missile capabilities. And I know, Kelsey, you mentioned MTCR and PSI, kind of passive outside export in other ways. But as we know, JCPOA, instead of going after this, loosens them after 8 years. And so if your predictions, if the mights here come about, in 5 years or something is the timeline you give, then in 8 years when the sanctions go off, where does that put us? And should we not be thinking about a diplomatic offensive to roll this back? Now, if the answer to that is there's no appetite for that, either among our European friends, us, or the Iranians, then doesn't that mean we have to move very decisively to the expensive strike and missile defense capabilities to answer this?
It's a great question.
Yeah, it is a good question. I'll take the first stab at it. I think there was a reason that the missiles were not included in the JCPOA. There was enough difficult challenges in and of itself. And as long as the missiles aren't armed with nuclear weapons, the existential threat they pose to the region, I think, is reduced. So if you focus on what makes them incredibly dangerous. And I think that was personally the right decision to make. It doesn't make me happy that it wasn't included. I don't want to create the wrong impression. In terms of diplomatic measures, I think that the biggest challenge would be how Iran thinks about their missiles. For Iran, I mean, it's in their DNA. It's one of the 3 central pillars of their defense and deterrence strategy. Those that grew up during the wars of the cities, it left an indelible impression. I mean, it's no coincidence that they parade these things around. They use test launches and military exercises just to message their deterrent capability. So I think the willingness on the Iranian side is going to be, the pressure you'd have to put on them is enormous. I think the more interesting longer-term question is, as they're able to import advanced aircraft and other weapons from China, Russia, or whoever, does the priority missiles have now, does it become reduced? I would argue probably not as long as the current commanders are in place and such, because they have bought into this narrative that missiles are their defensive capability. But I think over the longer term, they may see reason to invest their money otherwise. But that will depend on the relationship they have with the regional rivals and with the U.S. in the region. It would be nice for a diplomatic solution. I've been looking at an effort to create an agreement within the region that prohibits missiles with ranges of 2,500 kilometers, maybe 3,000 kilometers, with verification measures, confidence building measures included in it. Whether that will gain any traction in the region remains to be seen, but I think this is one way of kind of maybe using salami tactics on the Iranians to reduce the future capabilities.
Can I?
Yeah, please.
I certainly agree that I think keeping missile limits outside of the JCPOA was a wise move for multiple reasons. And I actually think Iran had a strong case when they wanted the testing prohibitions and the sanctions on missiles to be lifted immediately, because they were imposed to get Iran to negotiate, and they did. So I view these years as a bonus. And I think you raise a very good point of, what can we do with this time? And I think that there are some interesting options for a diplomatic approach. Some have discussed the idea of trade-offs on missile limits for access to dollar clearing. I'm a little hesitant to go down that road, because I think it opens the door for Iran to leverage other things to get around sort of certain sanctions that I think should remain in place. But I think a regional approach is more interesting for several reasons, because I also don't see Iran agreeing to limit its ballistic missiles when no other country in the region is subject to those limits, even if they don't have the capabilities. I don't see that just from their view of their own position in the region. But looking at areas like notifications for testing, that's something that has been successful in India, Pakistan. As Mike said, some sort of range restriction, perhaps other measures to build confidence as part of reinvigorating the process towards the Middle East WMD-free zone. I may still be the only believer in that idea, but I think it's an option. I think exploring those is something that the next president, the U.S. should really consider and look at options for.
I think that, of course, having not been involved in negotiations on the nuclear issue, I don't know whether something could have been done on this as well, because of the pressures that Iran was subjected to, and Iran was in violation on the missiles as much as it was on the nuclear issue. So because they were violating UN Security Council resolutions with regard to both. And that's the law. I mean, you may not agree with it, but I don't think they like the sanctions on the nuclear issue any more than, but they thought they were within their rights to develop enrichment and so forth. So, but that's for another day. But on the going forward, the question is, how do you get leverage over this issue for diplomacy to have any chance? As we see in Syria, when you don't have leverage, you're rather unlikely to be effective. Can we put enough sanctions based on the missile concerns and get enough cooperation like we did on the nuclear issue without undermining the nuclear agreement? And that may be one constraint that the administration, this one at least, thinks that will be a risk if you go too far in the sanctions business. And there may not be the international will, besides, to do it. So a couple of things that may not be enough is what Mike was saying. If since they're inferior in terms of conventional capability, otherwise, for example, aircraft, whether we can get an agreement with those who might sell them aircraft to say yes, but that has to be in exchange for constraints on the missile program, for example. I'm not that optimistic we will get a regional kind of agreement, although it's very much because the region is going in the opposite direction. But hopefully that will change. So the question is, this is very important for Iran. The missile program is one of their key programs, as was said, and it will require a lot of risk and reward for them to recalibrate that, and I don't see the will right now. Of course, as you said, the next administration might take a look at this. So I'm not terribly optimistic, in other words.
If I could just add to that, if you remember, after the last two tests, several nations got together and issued a very strong statement that said things like the tests were inconsistent with and in defiance of UN Resolution 2231, demanded a report, and then the report said, as Kelsey mentioned, those tests were unhelpful. So with that kind of strong,
very strong
response, I'm not sure we're gonna do much better.
I'm sure we didn't want anything stronger than that.
Right.
It's hard with convention.
Gentlemen in the purple shirt.
Hi, Charles Perkins with APAC. Again, both to Mike and
Mike had to use the bathroom, sorry.
Yeah.
He'll be
He
back.
did not vacate the place.
Congratulations to both on very important treatment of the subject. One, I guess this is more for you, Bilal. Has Iran, do you believe, been informed at all by the current ongoing use of ballistic missiles in Syria, where it doesn't get the publicity that barrel bombs have, but there's been extensive use of their the Syrian ballistic missile arsenal in really horrific fashion. But also, I think there's been some exchanges in Yemen lately, and I think even in Iraq against ISIS. do you think that this experience in terms of lessons learned may have had an impact in their evolving concept at all? And then maybe this is more for Mike, but ballistic missiles obviously aren't the only systems that the Iranians have, and although they may claim to have more in the way of armed drones, cruise missiles, and so on, then they really do, in fact. They also are making progress in this direction as well. And I'm wondering if you could say anything about it. I noted there really wasn't much in your book, in the paper on this. If that's something of as serious concern in terms of accuracy in particular, the precision front, as on the ballistic side. And then just briefly, I would definitely echo what Kelsey said about MTCR and PCI. These are regimes that have been around for a long time, but I think they could definitely be rebooted in the near future as a way of adding and complementing to the sanctions as a means of stopping technology coming into the Iranian.
Well, I have an incredibly short answer for the first one. I have no clue. Maybe, maybe not. Do they have some uses, limited uses in the battlefield that they're now really experiencing with? Maybe. But we're talking about something a little bit different here with a set of adversaries that have, some close relations with the United States. So it's a different strategic mix. But are they closely monitoring the effectiveness or the utility of those usages in the theaters that you just mentioned? Maybe. To what extent does that really have an effect on the doctrine? I really can't say. Your second question was more to Mike, right?
You want to just ask it again?
Sure. I noted that the paper didn't really cover cruise missiles, armed UAVs, things like that the Iranians have been purporting to have a significant growing capability, but may or may not have. In terms of specifically the precision added value here, how much of an issue is that?
We don't know nearly as much about the cruise missile program because their flight tests can be done more covertly than their missile tests, for one. At least in the public domain, we don't know. But cruise missiles have the potential to be precisely guided because they can use GPS more easily. They travel at lower speeds. They're controlled through the entire flight and those things. Armed drones, same thing. But it's not something that they're going to immediately have. I think there's other limitations. Cruise missiles, in one way, are easier to defend against. In other ways, they're more difficult. But this is an area that Iran has been working slowly. I think their biggest impediment will be access to turbofan or turbojet engines. Missile engines are difficult to make, but an effective turbofan engine is probably far more difficult, and there's a limited number of suppliers. And I think those suppliers keep a pretty close tab on them. It has been interesting that we haven't seen a full flight test of the KH-55s that Iran acquired from the Ukraine. They did some demonstration tests to make it look like it was a test, but it'll be interesting to see if that pops its head up sometime in the future. But it is a concern. But we wanted to limit the scope of this to just ballistic missiles for now.
Sure.
Thank you very much. My name is Behnam. I'm a senior Iran analyst at FDD, and really want to commend Bilal and Mike for an excellent paper and well scoped with the conventional in front of the missile threat. Two very quick questions, and they're both for Mike. I apologize. The first is, Mike, you mentioned something about the Iranian word for the Persian word for deterrence, the doctrine. The word I've seen in the strategic literature is bazdarandagi. It's like it implies more of a deterrent defense than as we see deterrence. I wanted to know what you had heard about that or what you had seen about that. The second is, as you know, it's Sacred Defense Week in Iran, and every year they unveil new weapons or mock-ups of weapon systems. And we want to know, what do you make of the weapons that Iran unveils but doesn't flight test. You mentioned the KH-55. Iran calls it the Sumar land attack cruise missile. As far as I know, they haven't flight tested that. They haven't flight tested the Fateh 313, which they unveiled after the nuclear deal last year. So they unveil it, but they don't flight test it. Do you think this is just more deterrent posturing, or are they really inaugurating new lines of production for these things that we simply can't see in the open source, be it in English or Persian?
Both good questions. Thank you. In terms of the parade that occurred at the beginning of the week, the two things that I took notice of were this new system they call the Zulfikar, which I think is just the Fateh 313. They claimed it had a range of 750 kilometers. I think it's closer to about 300 kilometers, but I haven't done a detailed assessment of what they presented. I have of the Fateh 313. I don't know if they've been testing the Fateh 313. They may be doing it covertly. This is something that they can conduct in the inlands, and it would only be detected by radar. I always worry that because there was so much international, as an analyst, not as a, being able to do analysis. The ostracization that they underwent after testing missiles again, it may drive them to not announce them and not provide videos, which makes my job more difficult. But if they're truly testing and we're not learning about it, it makes assessments much more difficult. I'm sure that countries with a lot of overhead capability and radars in the region can monitor the tests. So if they are, that I'm pretty certain that we would know, the government would know about it. On deterrence, the best way it was explained to me by a Farsi-speaking person was the word is essentially, it's like, putting your hands up to defend yourself. And so that's the word I've been going. It does mean defend. It also means somewhat to deter by pushing back. But how it's used in the strategic literature and how, more importantly, how the Iranians view that word is a little less clear to me because I don't speak Farsi. And it's, it would be interesting to work with people that do and also understand, at least Western concepts and, Chinese concepts of deterrence, because I think this would help us better understand how Iran is thinking about potential warfare and, what their triggers might be for war.
Can I ask maybe Mike this? I mean, when you read their literature on deterrence, when translated, I mean, do they believe that in order to have the deterrence capability, you need to be able to survive an attack, then make a decision, deliberate decision, communicate that decision, then execute that decision and do what you want to the adversary as a result? I mean, how do they kind of put all the requirements that I just said? Is that what they believe is to have a deterrent capability means what to them?
That's a good question, and I'm probably not the best person or even close to it to answer it. But from what I have read, you look at their Mosaic doctrine, for example. This is something that devolves decision-making down to really low levels because, again, one of the lessons they learned from 1991 when we tried to decapitate
so their deterrent
Saddam.
Is to launch under attack, so
yes,
as you would say.
I would say it's probably closer to that, but it would be a decision that's made down at lower levels.
Well, it's different.
If they're decapitated. If they're not decapitated, it might be a little bit different.
It could be both deterrence by denial and by punishment, which gets us back to the missiles, the accuracy. Because if they are attacked and now they have more accurate missiles, then they can punish the adversary.
But they would have to survive. They would think they would have to have
assuming it's not an overwhelming. Good thing it's not all nuclear. I mean, it really goes back to your first point because it's really crucial.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our time. I want to thank the Brent Scowcroft Center for International Studies for hosting, and thank all of you for coming. Please join me in thanking our excellent panel.
Hey, to Mike and Bilal.